The Bulgarian seer Vanga, renowned for her predictions that span decades, is said to have envisioned a future where three nations rise as global powers, while three others vanish from the political and geographic map. Her visions, shrouded in mystery and symbolism, were not simple statements but fragments of a world in transformation, a world where power shifts, borders dissolve, and humanity is forced to reevaluate its very existence. According to accounts from her followers and interpreters, Vanga described a scenario through vivid imagery and metaphors that, over time, have been decoded and connected to contemporary events. The rise of three nations, she foresaw, would not come solely from military or economic might, but from a combination of factors including technology, spirituality, cultural influence, and the ability to adapt to climate and social changes sweeping the planet. The first country Vanga reportedly mentioned as an emerging power was China. In her visions, she spoke of a dragon that awakens and covers the world with its shadow, a metaphor widely interpreted as a direct reference to China. With its fast-growing economy, technological advances in artificial intelligence, renewable energy, and infrastructure, China already shows clear signs of global leadership. Its influence spreads through investments in developing nations, strategic trade agreements, and an increasingly dominant role in international organizations. Vanga is said to declare that the dragon does not roar, yet all can hear it, suggesting a silent yet inevitable rise, marked more by diplomacy and economic expansion than outright conflict. The second rising nation in her visions was India. Vanga described it as a river of light flowing across the world from the south, often interpreted as a reference to the spirituality, culture, and innovation emerging from India. With its youthful and growing population, advancements in information technology, medicine, and space exploration, India positions itself as a power on the rise. Moreover, its ability to maintain a functioning democracy amid vast ethnic and religious diversity is seen as a model for other nations. Vanga reportedly stated, "Ancient wisdom will become new strength," pointing to India's cultural and philosophical heritage as one of the foundations of its global influence. The third emerging nation, though less frequently mentioned in her prophecies, is believed to be Brazil. Some accounts claim she spoke of a land of fire and water that will rise when others fall. This has been interpreted as a reference to Brazil, with its immense biodiversity, natural resources, and energy potential. In a world grappling with climate crises, Brazil could become a leader in environmental preservation, food production, and energy transition. The Amazon rainforest, often referred to as the lungs of the world, stands as one of its strategic assets, and Brazil's ability to protect and sustainably use these resources could place it at the center of global decision-making. On the other hand, Vanga is said to have foreseen the decline and disappearance of three nations, not necessarily through physical destruction, but through political, social, or environmental collapse. The first among them was Japan. In her visions, she spoke of islands sinking under the weight of time, which many interpret as a reference to the Japanese archipelago. With its constant seismic risks, rapidly aging population, and economic challenges, Japan faces obstacles that could diminish its global relevance. Vanga is said to have remarked, "The sun will fade in the east," a poetic yet ominous phrase about the nation's future. The second nation she foresaw vanishing was Ukraine. Her visions mention a land divided by blood and iron, aligning with the conflicts plaguing the region. War with Russia, political instability, and infrastructure destruction may lead to a complete reconfiguration of its territory, with parts absorbed by other nations or transformed into autonomous states. Vanga reportedly warned, "The fertile field will be burned and sown by foreign hands," hinting at a loss of sovereignty and national identity. The third disappearing nation was the Netherlands. In her visions, she referenced land below the sea that will be swallowed when the waters rise, widely interpreted as a direct allusion to the Netherlands. Despite its advanced water management systems, the nation already faces serious challenges from rising sea levels. Vanga predicted, "The dikes will not contain the eternal sea," suggesting that human efforts may prove insufficient against the forces of nature. The Netherlands' disappearance would symbolize the vulnerability of nations in the face of climate change. Though cloaked in mystery, these visions inspire profound reflection on humanity's future. They should not be taken as absolute predictions, but rather as symbolic warnings about the paths we are walking. The rise and fall of nations is not merely a game of power, but a reflection of collective choices, adaptive capacity, and wisdom in confronting global challenges. Through her enigmatic language and poetic imagery, Baba Vanga invites us to look beyond the present and imagine a world in constant transformation, a world where power is fleeting and survival depends on harmony between peoples and with nature. Baba Vanga's visions were not limited to isolated images of rise and fall. They formed a complex mosaic where the destinies of nations were intertwined with cosmic events, climate change, technological revolutions, and spiritual transformations. The rise of three nations and the disappearance of three others was not merely a reshuffling on the geopolitical chessboard, but a reflection of a profound shift in human consciousness. Vanga reportedly said, "The world will be divided not by borders, but by vibrations," suggesting that future power would not be measured only by territory or wealth, but by a nation's ability to resonate with the new times. China, already described as the awakening dragon, does not simply expand economically, but redefines the very concept of global leadership. In her visions, Vanga spoke of cities of glass and light, rising where once was dust, interpreted as a reference to China's rapid urban and technological growth. Megacities like Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Beijing have become hubs of innovation, where artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and clean energy converge to create a new model of civilization. China does not seek domination through force, but through integration. Its Belt and Road Initiative connects continents, cultures, and economies, building a network of influence that transcends traditional imperialism. Vanga is said to have declared, "The dragon will teach others to fly," indicating that China will serve not only as a leader, but also as a mentor to developing nations. India, in turn, emerges as the river of light Vanga envisioned flowing across the world. This light is not only metaphorical but literal. India is investing heavily in solar energy, becoming a global reference for sustainability. At the same time, its ancient culture, rooted in principles of nonviolence, meditation, and balance, begins to deeply influence the West. Vanga reportedly said, "The wisdom of the Himalayas will be heard in the squares of the world," pointing to the spread of India's spiritual values across the globe. India is also excelling in space exploration, with ambitious missions to the Moon and Mars, and in the digital revolution, with millions of young programmers and entrepreneurs shaping the future of technology. India's rise is marked by a fusion of tradition and innovation, spirituality, and science. Brazil, the land of fire and water, begins to stand out in a world increasingly concerned with the environment. Vanga said, "The green heart of the world will beat stronger when the lungs fail," a clear reference to the Amazon rainforest and Brazil's role in preserving planetary life. As droughts, floods, and food shortages spread, Brazil becomes a strategic breadbasket, with agriculture adapted to new climate conditions and biodiversity serving as a source of pharmaceutical and genetic research. Beyond resources, Brazil starts to export knowledge. Its universities, research centers, and startups gain international recognition. Brazilian culture, with its unique blend of ethnicities, rhythms, and beliefs, becomes a symbol of resilience and coexistence. Vanga reportedly declared, "Where there is dance, there is life, and where there is life, there will be power." While these three nations rise, others face collapse. Japan, with its aging population and dependence on imports, begins to lose its capacity for renewal. Vanga spoke of rusted swords and empty temples, evoking a loss of identity and purpose. Japan's youth, pressured by rigid systems and overwhelming expectations, turn away from traditional life, creating an existential crisis. Natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, become more frequent and destructive, overwhelming even Japan's advanced engineering. The economy stagnates, and Japan drifts toward irrelevance in global decision-making. Vanga reportedly said, "The sun will hide behind the clouds of doubt," a metaphor for the nation's loss of confidence and direction. Ukraine, already devastated by conflict, falls into a cycle of fragmentation. Vanga spoke of fields changing hands as the wind changes direction, suggesting that Ukrainian territory will be contested and divided. The war with Russia, far from an isolated event, triggers a chain of geopolitical changes leading to Ukraine's dissolution as a unified state. Regions break away, alliances crumble, and the people are forced to seek refuge and rebuild in foreign lands. National identity fades, and Ukraine disappears not through physical destruction, but through political and cultural disintegration. Vanga is said to have declared, "The fertile land will be sown by hands that do not speak its language," a powerful image of lost sovereignty. The Netherlands, finally, faces a silent enemy, the sea. Vanga described cities sleeping beneath shattered mirrors, a poetic reference to the floods threatening the nation. Despite its advanced water management systems, rising sea levels and increasingly violent storms render parts of the country uninhabitable. The population is forced to migrate as territory is slowly lost. Vanga warned, "The windmills will turn in search of land that no longer exists," a metaphor for humanity's desperate struggle against nature. The Netherlands vanishes not by war, but by the slow, inevitable erosion of its land, becoming a symbol of humanity's fragility in the face of planetary forces. These visions, though enigmatic, invite us to reflect on the path we are taking. The rise of some and the disappearance of others is neither punishment nor reward, but the consequence of collective choices. Through her symbolic language and connection to dimensions beyond time, Baba Vanga reminds us of the need for balance, wisdom, and humility. The future is not written in stone, but in possibilities. And every nation, every people, holds the power to shape its destiny or to be shaped by it. Baba Vanga's visions, though shrouded in mystery, were not limited to poetic images or vague metaphors. They formed a continuous, almost prophetic narrative about the destiny of humanity. The rise of 3 countries and the disappearance of 3 others was not an isolated event, but part of a great global reconfiguration that, according to her, will begin to manifest strongly in 2025. This date, marked by a devastating conflict in Europe, will be the turning point for a new era, where power would shift hands and the global political map will be redrawn. Vanga is said to have declared, "The old continent will be wounded from within and its scars will not close." This phrase, interpreted by many as a reference to Europe, suggests that the conflict will not only be military, but also cultural, economic, and spiritual. The war between Russia and Ukraine, already underway, would be just the beginning. Instability would spread, affecting neighboring countries, provoking mass migrations, economic collapse, and a collective identity crisis. In this scenario, nations that were once pillars of European stability would begin to crumble, while others outside the traditional axis would gain strength. The rise of China, India, and Brazil, as seen in the previous parts, does not come solely from internal merit, but also from the collapse of Western models. Baba Vanga is said to have mentioned, "The world will seek new masters, for the old ones have lost their voice." This phrase suggests that global leadership will be transferred to nations offering new solutions, new values, and new forms of social organization. China, with its centralized governance and technological focus, offers efficiency. India, with its spirituality and innovation, offers balance. Brazil, with its biodiversity and culture coexistence, offers hope. But the disappearance of countries such as Japan, Ukraine, and the Netherlands does not come only from external factors. Vanga is said to have spoken of nations that forget themselves and become shadows of what they once were. This powerful image indicates that collapse begins from within, with the loss of purpose, identity, and cohesion. Japan, for example, faces an unprecedented demographic crisis. The population is aging rapidly. The birth rate is plummeting, and young people are drifting away from tradition. The country, once a symbol of innovation and discipline, begins to grow introspective, almost apathetic. Vanga is said to have said, "The land of the rising sun will see the sun set, not knowing how to rekindle it." Ukraine, in turn, is torn apart by external and internal forces. The war with Russia is not only territorial but symbolic. It represents a struggle between past and future, between sovereignty and influence. Vanga is said to have mentioned, "The fertile land will be divided like bread in times of famine," indicating that Ukrainian territory will be carved up among powers, separatist groups, and foreign interests. National identity fragments, and the country loses its unity. Even if parts of Ukraine survive as autonomous regions or satellite states, the nation as we know it disappears. The Netherlands faces a silent and relentless enemy, the sea. Vanga is said to have spoken of cities drowning in silence while the world looks the other way. Rising sea levels, combined with more intense storms and climate change, begin to render some regions uninhabitable. The dikes, long a symbol of Dutch resilience, are no longer enough. The population is forced to migrate, and the country begins to lose territory. Vanga is said to have declared, "The windmills will turn in search of land that no longer exists," a metaphor for the desperate struggle against nature. These visions are not mere predictions, but warnings. Vanga did not speak of inevitable destinies, but of possibilities. She is said to have declared, "The future is like a river. It can be diverted but not stopped." This means that nations still have time to change course, to reinvent themselves, to avoid collapse. But this requires courage, wisdom, and collective action. The rise of some and the disappearance of others is not a zero-sum game, but a reflection of the choices we make as humanity. In her broader visions, Vanga also spoke of cosmic events, such as solar storms, contact with extraterrestrial civilizations, and the exploration of Venus as a source of energy. These events, though they may seem distant, are part of the same cycle of transformation. She is said to have declared, "When the sky speaks, men will listen, but for some it will be too late." This phrase suggests that the signs are everywhere, in climate change, political crises, technological revolutions, yet many still ignore them. Vanga's timeline is impressive. 2025 marks the beginning of Europe's collapse. 2028, the exploration of Venus. 2033, the melting of the polar ice caps. 2076, the global spread of communism. 2130, contact with aliens. 2170, a devastating drought. 3005, a war with Martian civilization. 3797, the evacuation of Earth. And 5079, the end of humanity. Each milestone is a piece of a puzzle that reveals a future of extreme challenges, but also of extraordinary possibilities. Vanga was not merely a seer, but a messenger. Her words, often enigmatic, carry an urgency that still resonates today. She is said to have declared, "Time does not wait, and the world does not forgive those who sleep." This phrase is a call to action, to awareness, to transformation. The countries that rise are those that awaken, that adapt, that lead with wisdom. The ones that disappear are those that resist change, that close themselves off, that forget their essence. Baba Vanga's visions, though often interpreted as isolated prophecies, form a continuous fabric of warnings, revelations, and possibilities. In Part 4, we dive into the interconnection between the countries that rise to power and those that disappear, not as independent events, but as parts of the same cycle of global transformation. Vanga is said to have declared, "The world is a scale, and when one side rises, the other falls," suggesting that the rise of China, India, and Brazil is directly linked to the decline of Japan, Ukraine, and the Netherlands, not through direct competition, but through a shift in paradigm, where the values, models, and structures that sustain traditional power become obsolete. China, for example, does not simply grow in influence. It redefines the concept of hegemony. Vanga is said to have mentioned, "The dragon does not need to roar to be feared," indicating that Chinese power will be exercised subtly, strategically, and almost invisibly. Through trade agreements, infrastructure investments, and control of supply chains, China becomes indispensable to the functioning of the world. Nations that once set the rules now depend on Chinese technology, resources, and diplomacy. Vanga is said to have declared, "The world will bow not out of fear, but out of necessity," a phrase that captures the essence of this new power dynamic. India, in turn, emerges as a pole of balance. Vanga is said to have spoken of a country that carries the past on its back and the future in its hands, an image representing the fusion of tradition and innovation. India not only advances in science and technology, but also exports spiritual values, models of coexistence, and sustainable solutions. In a world fragmented by conflicts, India offers dialogue. In a planet suffocated by consumerism, it offers simplicity. Vanga is said to have declared, "The wisdom of silence will be stronger than the cry of weapons," indicating that India's influence will be more philosophical than military. Brazil, meanwhile, begins to occupy a symbolic place in the global imagination. Vanga is said to have mentioned, "The land where the sun dances with the rain will be the refuge for those who seek life," a poetic reference to Brazil's biodiversity, its culture of welcome, and its regenerative capacity. In a world devastated by climate change, Brazil becomes a laboratory for environmental solutions. The Amazon, once seen as a resource, begins to be seen as a sanctuary. The Cerrado, the Caatinga, the Pampas, and the Atlantic forest become sources of study, preservation, and reverence. Vanga is said to have declared, "Where there is green, there will be hope," and Brazil becomes a guardian of that hope. Meanwhile, the nations that disappear face not only external crises, but internal collapse. Japan, for instance, begins to turn into a ghost nation. Vanga is said to have spoken of streets filled with light, but empty of footsteps, an image representing the aging population, the abandonment of traditions, and the loss of purpose. Japanese youth, pressured by a rigid system and suffocating expectations, begins to drift away from traditional life. The country, once a symbol of innovation and discipline, sinks into silent melancholy. Vanga is said to have declared, "The land of the sun will see the sun extinguished from within," a metaphor for the loss of vitality. Ukraine, torn apart by conflict, begins to fragment. Vanga is said to have mentioned, "The fertile land will be divided like bread in times of hunger," indicating that Ukrainian territory will be carved up among powers, separatist groups, and foreign interests. National identity dissolves, and the country loses its unity. Even if parts of Ukraine survive as autonomous regions or satellite states, the nation as we know it disappears. Vanga is said to have declared, "The field will be sown by hands that do not speak its language," a powerful image of the loss of sovereignty. The Netherlands faces a silent enemy, the sea. Vanga is said to have spoken of cities drowning in silence while the world looks away. Rising sea levels, combined with more intense storms and climate change, begin to make some regions uninhabitable. The dikes, long symbols of Dutch resilience, are no longer enough. The population is forced to migrate, and the country begins to lose territory. Vanga is said to have declared, "The windmills will turn in search of land that no longer exists," a metaphor for the desperate struggle against nature. These transformations do not occur in isolation. Vanga is said to have declared, "The world will be like a chessboard where the pieces change shape, not place," indicating that countries are not merely switching positions, but also functions. China becomes the new center of decisions. India, the new center of wisdom. Brazil, the new center of life. Meanwhile, Japan, Ukraine, and the Netherlands become memories, warnings, symbols of what happens when change is resisted or signs are ignored. Vanga is also said to have spoken of a new language that will be spoken by all, but understood by few. This phrase is interpreted as a reference to artificial intelligence, digital communication, and global interconnectedness. The countries that master this language, such as China and India, gain an advantage. Those unable to adapt, like Japan and Ukraine, fall behind. Brazil, with its creativity and adaptive capacity, begins to learn this language and use it to promote inclusion, education, and innovation. Baba Vanga's visions were not limited to the physical or geopolitical realm. They crossed spiritual, technological, and even cosmic dimensions, revealing that the rise and disappearance of nations are not merely historical events, but manifestations of a profound shift in human consciousness. In Part 5, we explore how these transformations affect not only the countries involved, but the entire structure of civilization. Vanga is said to have declared, "When the earth changes its skin, those who know how to dance to the new rhythm will survive." This enigmatic and powerful phrase suggests that the future belongs to those who adapt, those who read the signs, and those who align with the planet's new vibrations. China, already consolidated as an economic and technological power, begins to expand its spiritual influence. Vanga is said to have mentioned, "The dragon will learn to meditate, and its breath will calm the world," indicating that China will not only dominate markets, but also pursue inner balance. This transformation manifests in the popularization of practices such as Tai Chi, traditional Chinese medicine, and Taoist principles, which begin to be incorporated into public policy, education, and even diplomacy. China becomes an example of how technology can coexist with ancient wisdom. Vanga is said to have declared, Metal and spirit will merge, and the world will see a new form of power. India, in turn, deepens its connection with the cosmos. Vanga is said to have spoken of a country that will listen to the stars and answer with mantras, an image representing the fusion of space science and spirituality. India invests in telescopes, probes, and interplanetary missions, but also in studies of consciousness, meditation, and subtle energies. This duality between the physical sky and the inner sky makes India a hub of universal wisdom. Vanga is said to have declared, "Those who seek answers in the galaxies will find questions in the temples," suggesting that true knowledge will come from the integration of science and spirituality. Brazil, meanwhile, begins to emerge as a center of planetary healing. Vanga is said to have mentioned, "The land where the drum echoes will be the hospital of the soul," a reference to the spiritual strength of indigenous, Afro-Brazilian, and popular traditions. In a world sickened by consumerism, violence, and disconnection, Brazil offers rituals, knowledge, and practices that restore the bond with nature, the body, and the spirit. Ayahuasca, samba, candomblé, shamanism, and popular faith become sources of global inspiration. Vanga is said to have declared, "Where there is song, there is healing, and where there is healing, there will be leadership," indicating that Brazil will lead not through force, but through its capacity to regenerate. While these nations align with new vibrations, those that disappear face the spiritual collapse. Japan, for example, plunges into a crisis of meaning. Vanga is said to have spoken of temples without offerings and mirrors without reflection, an image that represents the loss of spiritual identity. Extreme modernity, social isolation, and cultural pressure create an existential void. Japan, once a symbol of harmony between tradition and innovation, begins to disconnect from its roots. Vanga is said to have declared, "The land of the sun will see the sun extinguished from within," a metaphor for the loss of spiritual vitality. Ukraine, torn by conflict, faces a fragmentation of the national soul. Vanga is said to have mentioned, "The land will be divided not only by weapons, but by broken dreams," indicating that the Ukrainian people will lose their inner cohesion. War destroys not only cities, but also hopes, bonds, and narratives. Ukrainian identity, built over centuries, begins to dissolve. Even if parts of the territory survive, the nation's spirit disperses. Vanga is said to have declared, "The field will be sown by hands that do not know its history," a powerful image of the loss of collective memory. The Netherlands, finally, faces the collapse of its connection to the land. Vanga is said to have spoken of houses that float without roots and people who walk without ground, a metaphor for the disconnection between people and their territory. Rising sea levels, forced migrations, and the loss of familiar landscapes create a sense of inner exile. The Netherlands, long a symbol of resilience against nature, begins to yield. Vanga is said to have declared, "The windmills will turn in search of land that no longer exists," a metaphor for the desperate struggle against the inevitable. These visions reveal that the future will not be decided solely by economics, politics, or technology, but by spirituality, consciousness, and vibration. Vanga is said to have declared, "Those who listen to the heart of the earth will know where to go," indicating that true leadership will come from those who align with natural rhythms, cosmic cycles, and ancestral wisdom. The rise of China, India, and Brazil is not only geopolitical, but spiritual. The disappearance of Japan, Ukraine, and the Netherlands is not only physical, but energetic. As Baba Vanga's visions unfold, it becomes clear that the fate of nations is not merely a matter of borders, economics, or technology, but a collective consciousness. The rise of China, India, and Brazil, and the disappearance of Japan, Ukraine, and the Netherlands reflect a profound shift in the way humanity organizes, connects, and perceives itself. Vanga is said to have declared, "The world will be like a body. Some organs will grow, others will wither, but the spirit will decide whether it lives or dies." This symbolic and unsettling phrase reveals that the planet is undergoing a systemic reorganization, where each nation represents a function, an energy, a mission. China, for example, assumes the role of the strategic brain. Vanga is said to have mentioned, "The dragon will think for many, and its ideas will be seeds in distant lands." China not only leads in artificial intelligence, but also in long-term planning, silent diplomacy, and social engineering. Its smart city projects, its ability to predict trends, and its influence over global markets make it a center of decision-making. Vanga is said to have declared, Thought will be more valuable than gold, and those who know how to think for all will be the new kings. In this context, China does not dominate by force, but through logic, foresight, and the ability to shape the future. India, in turn, becomes the spiritual heart of the world. Vanga is said to have spoken of a country that beats with the rhythm of the universe, and whose pulse will be heard by all. India not only preserves ancient traditions, but also renews them, shares them, and transforms into tools for healing, balance, and the expansion of consciousness. Meditation, yoga, the Vedic texts, and the teachings of gurus become part of global daily life. Vanga is said to have declared, "Those who listen to the heart of India will know how to survive the storm." In this vision, India does not lead by force, but by vibration, wisdom, and the capacity to unite science and spirituality. Brazil, meanwhile, assumes the role of the regenerating lungs. Vanga is said to have mentioned, "The land where the green sings will be the last refuge for those who seek air." In a world suffocated by pollution, environmental destruction, and climate crises, Brazil becomes a sanctuary. The Amazon, its rivers, forests, and indigenous knowledge become sources of healing, nourishment, and reconnection. Vanga is said to have declared, "Those who protect the green will be protected by time." In this context, Brazil does not lead by force, but by life, by nature, and by the ability to regenerate what has been destroyed. While these countries expand and function, those that disappear lose their mission. Japan, for example, once a symbol of precision, honor, and innovation, begins to fade into irrelevance. Vanga is said to have spoken of a country that forgot its sword and lost its path. Japanese culture, pressured by extreme modernity, urban loneliness, and spiritual disconnection, begins to dissolve. Japan, which once inspired the world with its aesthetics, discipline, and technology, now becomes a broken mirror. Vanga is said to have declared, "Those who do not reinvent themselves become statues in abandoned gardens." Ukraine, torn by wars, internal divisions, and external interests, loses its cohesion. Vanga is said to have mentioned, "The fertile land will be trampled by many, but will belong to no one." Ukraine, once the breadbasket of Europe, a cradle of cultures, and a bridge between East and West, fragments. War destroys not only cities, but also narratives, bonds, and hopes. Vanga is said to have declared, "Those who fight without knowing why are lost even when they win." In this vision, Ukraine disappears as a nation, as an idea, and as an energy. The Netherlands, finally, faces environmental collapse. Vanga is said to have spoken of a country that built walls against the sea, but forgot to build bridges to the sky. The Netherlands, a symbol of engineering, tolerance, and innovation, begins to be swallowed by the ocean. Rising sea levels, storms, and erosion make some regions uninhabitable. Vanga is said to have declared, "Those who defy the water without listening to the wind will be carried away by the current." In this context, the Netherlands disappears as a territory, as a culture, and as a function. These transformations are not punishments, but consequences. Vanga is said to have declared, "The universe does not punish, it only responds." The nations that rise are those that listen, that adapt, that align with the new times. Those that disappear are the ones that resist, that close themselves off, that ignore the signs. Humanity as a whole stands at a crossroads. To continue down the path of separation, destruction, and ignorance, or to choose the path of unity, regeneration, and wisdom. We have reached the conclusion of this journey through Baba Vanga's visions, where the destiny of nations intertwines with the destiny of humanity. Part 7 is not merely an ending, but a calling, an echo of the Bulgarian seer's words, who, though blind, saw beyond time, beyond borders, beyond matter. Vanga is said to have declared, "The end is not the end, but the beginning of another way of seeing." And with this phrase, we close the journey, understanding that the rise of China, India, and Brazil, and the disappearance of Japan, Ukraine, and the Netherlands are only reflections of something greater. Earth's transition into a new cycle of existence. According to accounts from her interpreters, Vanga foresaw the period between 2025 and 2076 as the most turbulent era in human history. A time of wars, environmental collapse, technological revolutions, and spiritual awakening. In this period, the nations able to adapt, reinvent themselves, and align with the planet's new rhythms will not only survive, but lead. Those that resist, cling to the past, or ignore the signs will vanish. But this disappearance is not necessarily destruction. Vanga is said to have said, "Those who vanish from the earth may be reborn in spirit." This means that even nations that lose territory, identity, or function can transform into ideas, legacies, seeds for the future. By the end of this cycle, China becomes not just a terrestrial power, but also a space power. Vanga allegedly said, "The dragon will fly among the stars and carry with it those who know how to listen." China leads interplanetary missions, builds lunar colonies, and develops quantum propulsion technologies. But it does not do this alone. It cooperates with India, which Vanga called the country that speaks with the cosmos. India, with its traditions of astrology, meditation, and cosmic connection, becomes a spiritual guide of space exploration. Together, China and India form an alliance that transcends Earth, leading humanity to new worlds. Brazil, on the other hand, becomes the guardian of Earth. Vanga reportedly said, "When others look outward, Brazil will look inward." While the world expands into space, Brazil deepens its connection with the planet. It develops environmental regeneration technologies, restores ecosystems, protects ancestral knowledge, and transforms its culture into a tool of global healing. Brazil does not lead through conquest, but through preservation. Vanga is said to have prophesied, "The last song of Earth will be heard as the first song of the new world." And this song will come from the forests, the sacred grounds, the indigenous peoples, and the drums that never ceased. Meanwhile, Japan, Ukraine, and the Netherlands become memories. Vanga reportedly spoke of nations that will live in books, in music, in dreams. Japan, with its aesthetics, philosophy, and discipline, becomes a reference for those seeking balance. Ukraine, with its resilience, fertility, and suffering, becomes a symbol of rebirth. The Netherlands, with its engineering, tolerance, and struggle against the sea, becomes a metaphor for resilience. These countries do not disappear completely, but cease to exist as political entities. They become archetypes, inspirations, fragments of a story that continues in other forms. Vanga also predicted that after 2076, the world would enter an ideological unification. Red will spread like fire, but will be water to some, she reportedly said, referring to the rise of collectivist, communal, and egalitarian ideas. Not necessarily traditional communism, but a new form of social organization based on cooperation, sharing, and balance. In this new world, borders become irrelevant. Currencies turn digital, and decisions are made through vibrational consensus, a kind of energetic democracy where the frequency of collective emotions determines the course of society. Spirituality also transforms. Vanga reportedly said, "Temples will be built of light, and the gods will be felt, not seen." This suggests that institutional religion will give way to experiential spirituality, where each individual connects directly with the divine, the cosmos, the essence of life. The nations that can facilitate this connection, such as India and Brazil, become centers of learning, initiation, and expansion of consciousness. Technology, too, fuses with biology. Vanga reportedly described machines that breathe and bodies that think like crystals. This represents the integration of artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and human consciousness. The nations that lead this fusion, like China, become the architects of the new world. But Vanga warned, those who forget the heart will be forgotten by time, meaning that technology without soul, without ethics, without purpose, will lead to collapse. True ascension will come from those who unite mind, body, and spirit. In the closing of her visions, Vanga mentioned the year 5079 as the end of humanity as we know it, but not as destruction, as transition. The veil will be lifted, and those with inner eyes will see what has always been there, she is said to have declared. This indicates that humanity will pass into another dimension, another form of existence, another vibration. Nations, cultures, languages, bodies, all will transform. But what will remain is essence, love, wisdom, connection. The story ends with this revelation. The future is not a place, but a state of being. Baba Vanga invites us to awaken, to listen, to feel. She warns us that time does not wait, and the world does not forgive those who sleep. The nations that awaken, that reinvent themselves, that connect with the new, ascend. Those that resist, that close themselves off, that forget their essence disappear. And we, as humanity, stand at the threshold of this choice.